black women and Latino women, historically. They were they realized if they were enslaved as a woman who was black or a woman who was Latina, and one who was exploited as a woman also, that double aspect to it. And then more specifically, which much of the petty bourgeois or bourgeois feminists either have no knowledge of or they are denying, is that one of the most unique, horrible things happened to African women that no other women on the planet had happening to them. During slavery, an African woman gives birth to capital out of her womb. Her womb was capital producing, even if the child was the master's child. 99% of the time, that was not a son or daughter of the master. That was a capital that was going to eventually produce capital. This concept is embedded in the very nature of Western culture, embedded in the very essence of capitalism itself. African women understood that. They knew that. They fought against that. They oftentimes were the key organizers in the anti-slavery movement. And I just step aside to give you one little example. South Carolina. Why were there so many rebellions in South Carolina in the 1700s and 1800s? And one of the reasons that we could see was the organization of African women. And they were organized at a high level in the 1800s because many of those African women were the rice farmers. And rice farming allowed at certain times of the year for those laborers to do other things. And so the other things that black women were doing in South Carolina were black women things. That is to say, they went to market. And going to market was a way of becoming social, to develop a social network. And they exchange ideas and so forth. And in many instances in South Carolina, they were the women who made contact with the black sailors who told them about various things, such as the insurrection and the revolution in Haiti and other things that were going on in the world. And that information was passed on. And they helped, in other words, to make a long story short, the rebellions in South Carolina and in North Carolina also were centered in terms of their organizing abilities, centered in the social networking of the enslaved African women. And that never disappeared. That transformed itself during the Civil War and afterwards within the various black women's organizations. So that when you have someone like Sojourner Truth speaking, "Ain't I a Woman," in New York State, that she was not speaking out of context. There was a black women's movement, if you will, or feminist movement already underway, and she was just part of that. So I think it's important for us to understand some of the central historical roots to the quote-unquote feminist movement in the West, and particularly in the United States. Another thing that we need to address also is the changing definition of race. The changing definition of race. If we were having this panel in 1903 in New York City, the Italian and the Jew would not be white. Okay? the changing definition of race. Capital changes the definition of social constructs for their benefit. And so as we move on through the 20th century, we have seen shifts in the definition of race. I don't even need to go back into the 19th century and different parts of the West where they had 127 variations of race, construct, and so forth, none of that. But what we just do is look at the 20th century and see that transformation, the changing definition of race, and then how we, people of color, try to define ourselves within that loose construct called race. And so we see, for example, La Raza coming up in the 60s and 70s on the West Coast with the Chicano movement, and seeing themselves as a people, as the Chicano people, somewhat distinct from Mexican, from people in Mexico, but obviously linked to that. We see the morphing of people of African descent from being Negroes to black to African American, and it is a very powerful movement, social movement that and cultural movement that have a dialectical relationship within themselves and also within the fight against racism and exploitation. So that in our discussions, when we talk about race in 2011, we need to understand that we're not talking in the same constructs as we talked 30, 40 years ago. And that we need to be clear on that, because the right is very clear on it. The right is on point in the way they're thinking. And one indication of that is how the census is taking place. And how, you know, the different categorizations that are placed on the United States Census for people of color, and the options that you have, you know, these categorizations are categorizations to atomize a political opposition force, not to gain data. So that, not so much to gain data so that the federal government can parcel out certain monies to this and that group, but that's one thing. But the other is an internal atomization, you know, where a person who may look like me can have the option of checking off Latino or checking off other or biracial or whatever other category. And it just helps to add to the confusion rather than making things clear.
It's been a really interesting discussion so far. I guess whenever I'm at the Left Forum, I get taken back to days when I was part of the organized left in the 70s and 80s as a young person, getting involved, dropping out to join the movement when there was a movement. And the discussions that we had back in the 70s and 80s, some of you are old enough to remember, I can tell, were, you know, that feminism and the ethnic-based movements were diversionary, bourgeois, reformist movements, right? That weren't going to lead to revolution because you could have an anti-racist and anti-sexist capitalist society. And I was attracted to a particular group in the organized left that didn't hold that position, that held the view that race and gender couldn't wait till after the revolution to be theorized and addressed. But, you know, we were having those debates 30 years ago, and you go to the Left Forum today and look around you. I mean, the masses and the millions are not at this particular panel, as we noticed. Maybe it was, you know, to the organizers' credit, they hoped they would be, so they gave us this big venue. But multiculturalism and identity, I think, are still, there's a new form of of putting aside questions of anti-racism and anti-sexism, homophobia, as not central to questions of capital, not central to questions of class, and not central to, for our organizing. So I asked myself, and this is the question I guess you raised, Charles, why are we in this state again? Why are we seeing revisited this kind of tendency that the New Left had in the 60s to shout down feminists off the stage? I mean, I think that there's a couple of things that I would point to. The right wing, as we know, takes a naturalist position about identity. They don't see identity as fluid in the way it's been described by the panelists. They think identities are natural, and they think conflicts are natural, right? And we know also that the right wing uses identities to obscure what's really going on, what they're up to, and to divide us. So the left, I think, has taken the view that if the right's going to be naturalist about identity, we're going to be anti-naturalists about identity. We're going to say that gender doesn't really exist, it's just a sort of trick, that race is a social construction. And so we're going to take an anti-naturalist position. In the academy, we talk about social construction. Everything is socially constructed. And that anti-naturalist position about race and gender and sexuality has led to an eliminativism, what we call in philosophy eliminativism. You know what I'm talking about, Charles. Eliminate. We want to eliminate race and gender. We see, and we take the analogy with class, right? Because class, we don't want to liberate society for poor people. We want to eliminate the category of poor people, right? So we imagine the future as not having class identities. And then we make an analogy to race and gender, right? We think that because we want to eliminate class identities, we must want to eliminate race and gender identities. And race and gender identities are the cause of a lot of problems of discrimination, of segmentation in the labor force, oppression, genocide, slavery, exile, annexation of lands, imperialism and colonialism, etc. So what's good about these things? Why would we possibly want to hold on to identities in our future societies? So this has led to, I think, a returning of the wheel. So we are exactly today where we were back in the 70s, in a new space of class reductionism with, in my neck of the woods in higher education, new dressed up theories coming from people like Zizek, very popular on the left. If he was sitting here today, there would not be a seat left, right? Zizek, Badiou, Nancy Fraser, leftists who attack multiculturalism, attack identity politics, attack feminism. Nancy Fraser's new book is a whole scale attack on feminism. And, I think this is a colossal mistake. I've always thought it. When I was on the left, I thought it, and now that I've been doing theoretical work on this for 30 years, I think it, because class was formed in the context of colonialism, as you just described, right? Class didn't pre-exist colonialism. Colonialism pre-existed class. Class was formed as a way through segmentation of the labor market by race and gender. And so when people talk about the logic of capital, it drives me crazy, right? They talk about how capital does what it does on the basis of this logic that is gender and race blind. Remember those old arguments? And of course it's not the case. Capital moves to where it moves to around the globe based on vulnerabilities of the labor market that are based on histories of colonialism, racism, and sexism. So capital is all about identity. It's organized through identity. So I think that to work our way back out of the class reductionism and out of the eliminativism, I don't think we need to go to a absolute naturalism about race and gender. We don't have to see race and gender as natural found objects that are discovered like you discover the planet Mars. We can have a more sophisticated notion of identity that understands the fluidity of racial categories and its changeableness, and that can understand I think there's some fluidity in regard to gender, although not as much because we have bodily differences and we play a different role in the division of biological reproduction. But we can have, I think, more adequate conceptualizations of identity that understands them as complex and overlapping and fluid without leading to eliminativism and class reductionism. And so I think we should, just the last point I'd make, I think we should approach concepts of identity sort of like as small theories. We should see them as theories, like the whiteness and the category of Latino identity, the pan-Latino identity, debated a lot in Latino circles, whether or not it has any adequacy or legitimacy. So identity categories are, they're like theories, and like theories, they emerge at a certain moment to answer certain questions. They have empirical adequacy, or they don't, right? The reason why people continue to use identity categories to self-ascribe by these categories is because those categories explain their world. They resonate with the world that they see, right? They resonate with the employment experiences that they have. So if we think of identity categories as like theories, we can judge them and test them and throw them out and modify them when needed. So we don't have to take them as absolutes like the right wing does. We don't have to take conflict between identity categories as natural and inevitable like the right wing does. But we can see that our social worlds are organized by identity, and we can have a discussion and try to come up with more adequate and more reasonable and more useful for political purposes understandings of what those identities are operating in our social worlds.
The ultimate hope, of course, of people at a forum like this is the building of a transformational movement. And such a movement presumably has to be organized under a banner of a certain kind. So many of the people on the panel have expressed sharp criticisms of the relation between the traditional left and these issues of gender and race and sexuality. But at the same time, the last three speakers in particular also emphasized capital. For example, Sam suggested that the black slave woman gives birth, in a sense, to capital, to an asset. Laurel spoke about the relationship between white supremacy and a particularly predatory kind of capitalism. Linda talked about the importance of, this sort of locating capitalism as a system that is racialized and gendered. So I think there's a kind of tension there. On the one hand, there's a whole set of criticisms of, in a sense, orthodox left theory. On the other hand, there's this repeated insistence on the centrality of capitalism and capital. So what I guess I'd like to ask all of you, is it the case that, historically, over the past few hundred years, the main alternative to left theory has been liberal theory? Is it possible to resuscitate liberalism in a form that's, as we know, feminist theories come in many varieties, but liberal feminists have been one important component. And certainly in the civil rights movement in the US, there have been people who have had a liberal conception of race and have seen themselves as people trying to purge liberalism of its racism. So if we start from the premise that the dominant varieties of liberalism over the past few hundred years have been patriarchal, have been racist, have been heterosexist, is it possible, you think, to have a transformed liberalism that's going to be an anti-racist liberalism, anti-sexist liberalism, and anti-heterosexist liberalism? Or can liberalism be retrieved by people on the left concerned about these oppressions, and can a transformed liberalism of that kind form this overarching political umbrella under which people would march towards a transformed society? Or is it the case that liberalism is so historically complicit, so tied up with these oppressions, that a transformed liberalism of that kind is not possible?
I can start.
Okay.
I've been really trying to grapple with liberal multiculturalism because that seems like the recent formation of the conceptions of race in the kind of Obama era that we live in today. And teaching my classes about race, my students, a lot of them are liberals. They come with a very liberal sentiment that, oh, race as a category needs to go away. This eliminatism, okay, I can't say.
Eliminativism.
Eliminativism, thank you. So this eliminativism concept has really taken a strong hold in students' minds and imaginations, and I had them turn in just a short two-page reflection a few weeks ago, and at least half the students in the class, in their reflection on race,